Greetings and welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. I'm Debbie Kay, League President. The League is dedicated to making democracy work. One of our core beliefs is that democracy functions best when voters are informed about issues and engaged in their communities. For that reason, we present programs like this one to give our Portland and Multnomah County neighbors, and in this case, our statewide friends, an opportunity to think about the issues that affect our lives and our well-being. We're pleased to present the publication of the League of Women Voters of Oregon's new study report, Pesticides and Other Biocides. This study reviews the environmental and health costs and benefits of pesticide use, the current state of regulation at the federal, state, and local levels, and the practices and precautions presently in place for pesticide use. It also discusses changes to practices that could improve outcomes and protect the environment and human health, while maintaining a stable, safe, and reliable supply of foods and other farmed products. Our program tonight is based on this study by the League of Women Voters of Oregon. You can find it at lwvor.org. 4 distinguished speakers will discuss the relevant issues addressed in the study report. The League of Women Voters of Portland is grateful for the support of the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation and from our media partner, Metro East Community Media. They record our civic education panels and voter education presentations, rebroadcasting them on community access channels, as well as our YouTube channel. Please tell your friends and family to watch this program when it is available through our website, lwvpdx.org, on or after September 16th. We sincerely thank our speakers, the moderator, and the League volunteers who donate their time and expertise to bring these programs to you. The moderator for tonight's program is Oregon League member Paula Grisafi. She is co-chair of the study. Congratulations to Paula and the other co-chair, Dr. Amelia Nestler, for this excellent report on pesticides and other biocides. Paula, I'm turning the program over to you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We are looking forward to hearing our panelists' thoughts about the impacts and issues of surrounding pesticide use and recommendations for their safe use. Our speakers will have 12 minutes each for their remarks before we open up the program for questions. Our first speaker is Dr. Amelia Nestler, who earned her undergraduate degree at Lewis and Clark College and her PhD in biochemistry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is a senior environmental scientist specializing in alternatives assessment at Northwest Green Chemistry, a regional nonprofit that works to enhance human and environmental health by fostering innovation and economic opportunities through sustainable and green chemistry and engineering solutions. She has been a member of the Drinking Water Advisory Committee for the League of Women Voters of Oregon since 2018, and is also the chair of our Pesticide and Biocide Use in Oregon Study Group Committee. Amelia, it's all yours.
Thank you, Paula. So I'm just going to start by setting the stage with a quick introduction to pesticides so that we're all in the same place as to what we're talking about, and give a brief overview of current policies and legislation around pesticides. Then I want to talk about the key findings in our report. It took a couple years to pull together and a lot of League member participation and volunteer hours. And I just want to acknowledge all of the League members who helped put together this study and just thank them. It was really a group effort. Okay, so what is a pesticide? A pesticide is a substance that's intended to kill, deter, or otherwise control specific organisms. They're made up of 2 kinds of ingredients. There's an active ingredient, which is the chemical or chemicals intended to kill or deter. Active ingredients are all toxic to something. And since all living creatures share some basic biology, it's challenging to make a chemical that will kill only one pest and then have no impact on anyone else. So all pesticides have what we call off-target effects. The inactive ingredients are everything else that's in the pesticide, and often they do not have to be disclosed. This does not mean that they are not toxic or that they do not change how those active ingredients behave. They simply are not the specific ingredient intended to have pesticide activity. There are many benefits to using pesticides. It improves crop yields that feed and house a large and growing human population. They're used to clean out ditches to support flood control, becoming increasingly important as climate change threatens our nation and the world with more and more extreme weather events. They can be used to help maintain clear road margins for road safety. They control pests that might destroy crops, that could carry disease, invade food storage, damage structures. Many times vector control works on mosquitoes, which can be disease bearing. And finally, they're often used to improve the appearance of lawns or gardens. Unfortunately, they come with toxic off-target impacts to humans and the environment. Pesticides often drift or migrate outside of the intended area, and that can result in the contamination of the environment or our homes. We have incomplete data on pesticide toxicity. There is a lot of data out there. There are a lot of requirements for registering them, but we don't have complete data, and that can result in some unanticipated consequences. These negative impacts commonly fall on already marginalized populations. Now, our current pesticide policy, really starting from the top down, the Environmental Protection Agency, or US EPA, is the primary agency involved. The main legislation is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. This is the legislation that requires pesticides to be registered with US EPA before they can be sold or used in the United States. It requires millions of dollars worth of testing to tell not only how toxic the chemicals might be and what kind of off-target effects they might have, but also to determine their efficacy against the pests they're designed to work on. A couple other pieces of legislation that EPA administers are the Clean Water Act, which deals with pesticide contamination in our waterways, and the Safe Drinking Water Act, which would deal with pesticide contamination in our drinking water. The Food and Drug Administration and the US Department of Agriculture, or USDA, are also involved in dealing with pesticide residue and contamination in food. And the Department of Labor and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, are involved through the Worker Protection Standard in managing pesticide concerns around workers. So for example, that's where you'd find requirements for using protective equipment for say a farm worker who's spraying pesticide on a crop. State agencies are also heavily involved. So there's a number of different agencies, some with a federal state interface, but some at the state level. So for example, and sometimes this even is how federal legislation is implemented. So even though the Clean Water Act is federal and it's managed by the US EPA, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is responsible for implementing it at the state level and must review each new or modified limit underneath that act. If the Oregon DEQ is not adequately funded, that can delay the implementation of this federal law that's also administered through EPA. So there are many different agencies and many different levels at which each of these different statutes are actually applied and then eventually enforced. Even counties and local governments can be involved. A few different events came up that occurred in Oregon in the last decade or so that I wanted to review, just a few that made the news in Oregon. In Wilsonville, the bumblebee die-off, there was a landscaping company that applied a neonicotinoid pesticide to flowering linden trees in a parking lot, resulting in thousands of dead bees. Neonicotinoid pesticides on the label state that they're not supposed to be applied to flowering trees, but labels sometimes are not obeyed. The Cedar Valley incident was when a helicopter leaked pesticide over a residential area while it was in transit to the intended application area. So there was no intent for any spill to happen or any application to happen there. Pesticide was still leaked. Triangle Lake, in this incident, residents complained of health impacts Eventually, there were some delayed urinalysis tests that showed that residents were exposed to pesticides, but overall the investigation was considered inconclusive as to whether or not this exposure had actually caused the health impacts that they were feeling. And finally, the old growth tree die-off. This was an interesting one. In it, ODOT used a pesticide, minocyclopyrachlor, ACP, near roadways for clearing vegetation and spread. That particular pesticide spread underground and then killed off some nearby old growth trees. That pesticide was going to be banned by EPA, but the company that registered it decided to pull it from the market instead. It was then reintroduced later under a different administration, different brand, and kind of circumvented that ban as a result. Now, of course, these are all negative incidences involving pesticides. We aren't going to be hearing about the successful uses of pesticides where it cleared a drainage ditch before the rainstorm and then there wasn't flooding and there was no off-target toxicity connected to it. So we hear about the negative events, but pesticides are used throughout the state and often in a positive way. In our report, we found that there are 5 different areas where we think there should be some focus to improve policy, minimize these off-target effects, and ensure that people who are exposed to pesticides are helped. So the first one is with education, training, and labeling. Many users are under the impression that if a pesticide is available on the shelf, it is safe to use. They disregard precautions that are on the label, assuming they even read the full label. Unfortunately, while trained applicators do have more education, they know that the label must be followed, they may still decide to ignore certain restrictions for expediency's sake. Improved education, training, and labeling could address these issues. Transparency and information gathering is another key area. There's currently no database monitoring pesticide exposures and potential health impacts, making it challenging to connect the more nebulous health impacts to specific pesticide exposures. Doctors are unlikely to be trained to look for potential exposures when faced with certain symptoms, particularly symptoms of chronic exposure. So we included in the report some specific recommendations around training for medical professionals and improved monitoring and testing and sharing of this information across the nation. We also need more complete public disclosure of the ingredients that go into pesticides, including those inactive ingredients. Of course, funding research and evaluation is another key area. Currently, manufacturers bear the burden of millions of dollars in efficacy and safety testing before a pesticide can be brought to market. Yet, there's still insufficient research into these off-target impacts that we've observed. So we need funding available to independent researchers that are not controlled by manufacturers. We also need more funding for developing safer, more targeted pesticides. The high expense for developing and registering a novel pesticide can be a deterrent to researchers who are interested in this area. Many companies choose not to engage in this research space as a result. And so this is an area where additional federal and state funding could help with that development of pesticides that can be used with less off-target impacts. Adaptive management and integrated pest management are 2 different ways of approaching pesticide use. So integrated pest management, or IPM, is commonly used throughout the nation. It prioritizes mechanical and cultural methods for pest control first, and then pesticides are used only if necessary, and you would start with the least toxic option. So for example, you might start by storing food in a pest-proof container instead of starting with using pesticides. And of course, if the pests could not be controlled by that, if there was no practical container to use, you would move on to the least toxic pesticide, so on and so forth. However, there are many different interpretations of what IPM is, and that can mean that one organization applying IPM uses substantial quantities of very toxic pesticides, while another organization in the same scenario uses far less. Both would claim to follow IPM and could justify it in some way. When required by statute, it's important to allow flexibility while defining some clear criteria for what's really required for IPM. Adaptive management builds on IPM by adding a layer of monitoring and policy revision. Science updates faster than statute. We should acknowledge that our knowledge of natural systems is incomplete and our policies may require adjustment over time. Adaptive management allows this to happen. The final area really comes down to what we want the foundation of our pesticide policy to be. Where does the burden of proof lie? Right now, manufacturers are required to do extensive testing. That is still insufficient to cover every possible toxic impact of these pesticides. And we could increase the requirement, but regardless, there will always be some unknowns. We will always have to make decisions in the face of incomplete data. So when uncertainty exists, should we lean towards assuming safety or should we lean towards assuming toxicity? In the same vein, who bears the burden of proof for showing that pesticides are safe to use, especially once these products are being used throughout the country? Under the status quo, it's often the impacted who have to prove their symptoms are the result of pesticide exposure. And they face an uphill battle on getting any kind of relief. So following the precautionary principle, one would generally assume toxicity in the absence of data. Of course, data is always preferable, and when it's present, you follow the data. And thinking about the burden of proof, it should be the person who wants to use the pesticides, the manufacturers who are using them, who have the burden of showing that they're safe for those uses. And with that, I would like to pass things back to Paula and thank her again for being my co-chair on this study. It was a pleasure working with you on this, and I think there's some really strong data in there.
As I said, thank you, Amelia. That was an excellent report, and I appreciate having worked with you as well. Our next speaker is Kevin Masterson, who has been with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality for 27 years. As the agency's toxics coordinator for the past 15 years, he led the development of an agency-wide toxic chemical and pollutant reduction strategy and the Oregon Pesticide Stewardship Partnership Program. For the last decade, he has also been on the board of directors of the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse, an association of state, local, and tribal governments that promote a clean environment, healthy communities, and a vital economy through the development and use of safer chemicals and products. Kevin will be leaving the DEQ at the end of the month and moving into an independent environmental consulting. Mr. Masterson, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks very much, Paula. I will get my slides up here. All right. Yes, thanks for this opportunity. And I have had a chance to work with Amelia and Lisa Arkin, Stephanie Page, and other folks that are on this panel for a long time. So I'm pleased to be able to share the wealth and information. And I was going to focus my remarks on water quality and pesticides, mainly focusing on surface water and the work that we're doing here in Oregon. So you can get an idea of what the challenges are that we face and what some of the solutions we've proposed and implemented, and some of the remaining gaps and needs that I see from my perspective still need to be addressed. So just in terms of getting an idea of the scope of the challenge that we have before us with pesticides in the environment, generally water being the final resting place for many of these pesticides, even though if they get discharged to the air, they hit the land and they can run off to the water. That's why we focus on water monitoring, and we're looking for a subset of about 1,000 registered active ingredients in the state of Oregon. By pesticides, we mean insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, antimicrobials, etc. So it's a range of compounds, and those 1,000 active ingredients are in over 12,000 registered products. So there are active ingredients that are in a number of different types of pesticide products. A lot of agricultural pesticides, but many home products, mosquito repellents, cleaners, etc. So we've got this massive number of chemicals, and at the same time we've got all these different types of users. We see pesticides used in rural agricultural areas, of course, forestry areas, rights of way, roadway spraying, recreational applications like golf courses, landscaping, urban and residential areas, etc. So there are a range of different land uses where these pesticides can find their way into water. Go over these slides really quickly. Again, I talked about the 1,000 active ingredients and 12,000 different registered products, and the different land uses, and just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how diverse these different land uses are, where we find pesticides being used, and all of the different ways that pesticides can get into water through drainage and drift. And this diagram kind of shows you how complicated the pesticide transport and fate process really is. It can involve a number of different methods and modes of getting into the air, to the soil, and then eventually running off or depositing in the water. And the east side of the mountains, we see a lot of pesticides getting into the water from spray drift. On the west side, we see a lot more runoff with sediment and water from rain events and from irrigation. So you can see, we also see a lot of groundwater potential contamination, and there is a relationship between groundwater feeding into surface water and vice versa. Most of what we're dealing with are what we call non-point sources. These days, it's not like we have a lot of major industrial users of pesticide that are discharging through a single pipe or through a stack that's regulated by DEQ or EPA. Stormwater being an exception. Municipal stormwater systems are considered point sources, even though they're collecting the pesticides and other contaminants from a variety of different original sources. So what we really see and what we're dealing with in Oregon a lot with our interagency efforts are the area-wide pollution sources, what we call non-point sources. That involves the leaching that I talked about, runoff, and drift. So that is our challenge. And this slide kind of illustrates what I'm talking about there with regard to non-point sources. You see this pesticide application happening in a hazelnut orchard, and this was taken on the way to a monitoring event that we had in the North Willamette Valley. And you see where that drift can go over the road and into another crop. But we also have roadway spraying that might be happening to keep the weeds down. And both of those types of pesticides, the herbicides along the roadway and the insecticide being sprayed here by this orchardist, could get into that drainage ditch and into the creek. Again, just to illustrate how complex this system could be. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on talking about the chemical regulations themselves, but I thought it was important to just make sure people understand that there is a major difference between pesticides and all other toxic chemicals when it comes to the front end regulation of these chemicals, as opposed to the back end pollution management regulations that DEQ and EPA also implement. So just in terms of how these chemicals get to the marketplace, pesticides are regulated by FIFRA, as Amelia referenced. All other toxic chemicals outside of drugs are mainly regulated by the Toxic Substances Control Act, and there's some major differences, one of which is that EPA does not delegate TSCA authority to the state. So we can't regulate the use and the sale of these substances that are not pesticides because we just don't have the authority. The legislature could pass laws that restrict those chemicals from being used, but DEQ does not. Whereas EPA delegates a lot of implementation authority to departments of agriculture, in some cases environmental agencies, but mostly departments of agriculture around the state. So ODA, other departments of agriculture have more control over the registration and use of pesticides. So that's an important distinction. However, the similarity is manufacturers of both pesticides and other chemicals, submit their data to EPA for review and registration. In the past, under TSCA, there wasn't much testing required of these chemicals, and that is the one advantage of pesticides. Testing has usually always been required. So in general, there's been historically more data produced on pesticides prior to them hitting the market. And the label also outlines how you use the pesticide, whereas TSCA doesn't have a similar kind of label. So this is a very important distinction because different agencies at the state level implement these different regulations. And in the case of TSCA, it's still EPA. Amelia mentioned some of these regulations related to water. So I won't go into much detail about them, but I thought it was important to note that under the Clean Water Act, DEQ is the delegated state authority, and we adopt in-stream numeric criteria for a number of pollutants, including toxic chemicals and toxic pollutants like legacy pesticides, which are still around like DDT, and we've got a lot of those criteria. However, we only have in-stream enforceable criteria for about 3 out of 1,000 current use pesticides. At least those are the 3 that we find commonly in Oregon waters. So that's a very small percentage that we have a handle on using the Clean Water Act. So that's important to note. We can develop pollution load limits, we call TMDLs, for those 3 chemicals that we find in the water, and the Department of Agriculture would implement limits through their existing authorities. We do have some other authority that's relatively new under the Clean Water Act, and that is this MPDs, which is a Clean Water Act permit for certain types of pesticide applications that result in discharges in, over, or near water. So typically, this general permit, which is kind of a one-size-fits-all permit for weed control districts, vector control districts like mosquitoes, taking care of mosquitoes, golf courses, lake and marina managers. There is a separate permit for irrigation districts, but has some similar provisions. So that is a one set of applications of pesticides where they're in or near water that we do have more regulatory control over. Then the Safe Drinking Water Act as well. This is implemented at the state level by the Oregon Health Authority, and the drinking water providers have to meet the standards. So that is a major distinction from some of these other regulations that are focused on those discharging the pollutants. So the regulated entities in this case are the water providers and not the pesticide users. And just like the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act doesn't have a lot of current use pesticides under its purview. And finally, the Endangered Species Act. This is a statute that is implemented by National Marine Fisheries Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And they issue biological opinions. In fact, they have biological opinions that have been issued or planned for 37 current use pesticides. So that's a larger universe than what's covered under the Clean Water Act. However, EPA needs to change the pesticide labels to incorporate those recommended actions in the biological opinions, which often are things like no spray buffers to protect the endangered species. In our case, it's salmonids primarily. But they don't regulate pesticide users, those fishery services. They rely on EPA to make the changes that they're recommending. So at the state level, we have a number of agencies that have authority. And Amelia referred to this to some degree. DEQ has the Clean Water Act, of course, Oregon Health Authority, Safe Drinking Water Act, Oregon Department of Ag, the pesticide regulations themselves, and the FIFRA responsibilities, and the Oregon Department of Forestry can regulate pesticides through the Forest Practices Act. OSU Extension has a lot of technical expertise, and so they're on our interagency pesticide management team. And the great thing about this team is that we're all on the same page when it comes to how we interpret the levels of pesticides in waters and the approach that we're going to take to address those pesticides. So we don't have one agency saying one thing and another agency saying a different thing. And our responsibilities are to develop a plan to protect water, which we did 10 years ago, got approved by EPA, and to identify the pesticides of highest concern. When we have high concern and moderate concern, pesticides and everything else is kind of on the low end of concern, but it allows us to focus on the problems of most impact or concern to various watersheds and to the state. We also oversee the implementation of the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership Program, which is our main way of addressing these non-point sources of pollution, not the folks that are violating the label and causing problems because they're not following pesticide regulations, but just the fact that we see so many users of pesticides, a little bit from everyone kind of adds up in many cases to a problem. And so that's what the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership Program is designed to do. We monitor for current use pesticides in surface waters from drift and runoff, and then identify streams with elevated levels, and then collaborate to implement voluntary best management practices. So we take the data, say, here's what we're finding, found 30 pesticides in the water, 5 of them are high priority, 3 of them are moderate priority, and the rest are low priority. We think you should focus on these 8, the ones that are at highest priority, and then continue to follow up over time. We've been in many of these watersheds for over 10 years or so. Right now we're in 9 different watersheds throughout the state. So the whole point of this program is to use monitoring data. Our laboratory at DQ takes samples. We have this interagency team led by Oregon Department of Ag that oversees the program, and then we work with a number of different stakeholders at the local level, grower groups, watershed councils, soil water conservation districts, stormwater authorities, all kinds of folks to try to implement these practices in response to the data, and then try to see the levels come down over time. And so we compare the monitoring results to EPA benchmarks, and we're lucky with pesticides that there is enough data that they can set benchmarks in the Office of Pesticides. These are not regulatory. They have enough data to look at different aquatic life receptors as well as human health benchmarks. And we look at the lowest ones and compare the results to those benchmarks. And then we also consider things like frequency of detection, because there's some uncertainty regarding the continual presence of very low levels of pesticides, low levels relative to those benchmarks. So we're looking at both how often we're finding it and the levels relative to these benchmarks. Because again, we don't have too many Clean Water Act criteria, so we rely on these benchmarks. And as I mentioned, we have these priority buckets, high, medium, and low, and we make those designations for both at the watershed level and statewide. And just to give you a quick couple examples of how we've seen some progress over the years, we've got many slides showing some success stories. This is just one simple one showing the maximum concentrations of 3 different pesticides that we've seen in 15 Mile Creek near the Dalles and Dufur. And right after we started doing the monitoring, we were able to communicate the results. A lot of these pesticides weren't even used by the agricultural producers in the area. They were used by rights-of-way operators like the county, diuron being one of them. That's a major concern. It's our herbicide, a major concern to our statewide team. It's very persistent. And over time, we saw those levels drop. And in fact, the last few years, we haven't seen any of the diuron or simazine. And then just most recently, in 2020, we saw a drop off to 0 of a pesticide or herbicide called oxyfluorofin, trade name Goal. It's used by nurseries and a lot of other agricultural operations. And we're seeing these levels kind of creep up, and some of them were exceeding benchmarks in the Middle Rogue area. Jackson Creek is near Medford and Central Point. And we were trying to figure out where this is coming from. And we did some more intensive reconnaissance monitoring to sort of narrow the geographic scope of where we were finding the most contributions. And we're able to engage OSU Extension to go out and do technical assistance, and found the major user. There were a couple, but one in particular that didn't know that they were causing a problem, made changes, switched to different herbicide for some uses and then put in a lot of best measure practices to reduce runoff. And all of a sudden, the problem just disappeared. I think we found in 2021 thus far, we found one very tiny hit of this. So these voluntary programs can work. One of the messages that we try to convey is that it's not a one-size-fits-all program. There are a number of different best practices that we put in place to try to solve these problems: spray drift reduction, use of biological controls like an integrated pest management that was mentioned, use of less toxic pesticide buffer strips, those kinds of things. So it's a variety of different ways of approaching the issue. And finally, I was just going to end by talking about these gaps and needs. And really I've posed them as questions. And some of them overlap a little bit with what Amelia was talking about. How do we get a better handle on the chronic impacts before the pesticides are registered at the federal level? This is definitely something I think the EPA needs to do at state level because of the amount of resources involved. And we've seen examples like imidacloprid, which is one of those neonicotinoid insecticides. And it had a benchmark of a little over 1 part per billion. And based on new data that came to light from third parties, we realize it's not just a bee impacting pesticide. It really has major fish and invertebrate impacts in the water. So the EPA dropped the benchmark by an order of magnitude. And so that can be problematic as we're changing the goalposts. And all of a sudden people are seeing that every time we see imidacloprid, it's a problem. So how do we get a better handle on those chronic impacts before the products are registered? And some of these low-level constant detections, sometimes we find these pesticides 75 to 100% of the time that we go out and take samples. Secondly, can we build in some chemical alternatives assessment frameworks? This is something that California is looking at. I was participating in a recent forum where they're talking about how to make sure that alternatives are looked at when registering pesticides or re-registering pesticides. And the inactive ingredients that Amelia mentioned, some of these could be more toxic than the active ingredients. They're things like adjuvants and surfactants, and we have information on them. EPA gets information on them, and we have a list of them, but we don't know what products they're in. So that would allow us to know what the water is really exposed to if we had that information. And then finally, the last one is more for the state rather than the feds is, what are the regulatory backstops that should be in place if the voluntary approaches aren't working? And we've had great success with the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership using the data to drive voluntary efforts, but there are some areas where we've had some trouble sustaining results and actually turning the corner. So how do we use the regulatory backstops? What are they? We're starting to talk about that. How do we implement them without alienating growers and displacing trust? But my experience for many years of doing this kind of work is having strong enforcement measures helps voluntary programs. You get more people interested in voluntary programs. They work hand in hand. So that's all I had.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin, for your remarks and for your leadership in this field.
I apologize for not sharing the screen earlier. I'll stop.
Our next speaker is Lisa Arkin. She is the Executive Director of Beyond Toxics, a statewide nonprofit organization established in 2001 that works to advance policies to ensure environmental and climate justice and pesticide reform. Beyond Toxics focuses on grassroots organizing in Oregon communities disproportionately impacted by pollution and climate change, and strives for equitable access to clean air, clean water, and safe spaces for all people to work and live in. Ms. Arkin, the floor is yours.
Hi there. So thank you, Lisa Arkin here, and I wanted to thank the League of Women Voters for their exemplary report, really excellent. I enjoyed reading it very much and I value it, and also value you for holding this panel today. And so I will proceed, I hope. Oh no. All right. Oops, sorry. All right. So indeed, we are an environmental justice grassroots organization, and we're building a community-based environmental justice movement to support clean air and water, non-polluting policies, clean energy, and vibrant communities. We have offices in Lane County and in Jackson County, and do try to serve the entire state with an environmental justice, environmental health framework. I really appreciated the slide, I think it was Amelia showing some critical moments in Oregon pesticide events, and we've been there at every single one of those, helping take grassroots concerns, community worries, and events that have impacted their health and bringing them to the attention of our partners, our nonprofit partners like the League of Women Voters and the legislature. So here's just a kind of a quick list of many of the things that we've been involved in. Some of the most impactful ones, well, they're all impactful. So I have bronchitis today, so I'll just keep powering through. In 2012, Senate Bill 613 established Oregon school pesticide law. And that was a project we worked on and brought forward to the state legislature. And at the time, it was the nation's strongest law to protect children from pesticides sprayed at schools. And sort of fast forward to 2021, we did work with the legislature to introduce a bill to update that law. But unfortunately, that was not able to pass, and we're hoping to work with the Department of Agriculture and Oregon State University and our lawmakers to make sure that law catches up with the science and the best practices. Also in 2015, we worked with this legislature to institute the very first buffers for aerial spray in the Oregon Forest Practices Act, which came about because of the incident in Cedar Valley that was described earlier, where there was spray that actually hit people, hit their property and their animals from a helicopter application on forest lands. So hopefully you'll ask me more about all this later, but I'll move on. Not knowing exactly what our other speakers were going to address today, I wanted to kind of take it to a high level and talk about 3 areas that we think Oregon could really move forward on and be leaders on, and not do kind of a whack-a-mole approach where we talk about chemical by chemical. Oftentimes it has to be that way because of an incident involving a chemical, like for example, when there was the bee die-off from the application of a neonicotinoid, or the sad case of the death of nearly 2,000 old-growth ponderosa pines, where we worked with the Department of Agriculture to restrict aminocyclopyrachlor, the chemical that moved through the groundwater and killed those trees. But we don't want to do all that all the time. We want to take a long view approach. And so I have these 3 recommendations working on the toxicity and protecting children's health, doing a better job of protecting our drinking water, and increasing our requirements for record keeping, disclosure, and reporting. And I want to, just for tonight, take a very narrow approach to all 3 of these by talking about endocrine disruption and non-monotonic dose responses. And 1 second. Thank you for your indulgence. So, we've all heard of this saying, the dose makes the poison, by Paracelsus. And that's still true. The more of a poison you get, the more likely you are to be poisoned. However, there's new science suggesting there are more ways of the relationship between exposure to a poisonous chemical and the act of being poisoned. This chart shows sort of that the dose makes the poison, as you would expect. There's a level of exposure where there's no response, and then it climbs upward off to the right toward what would be, I suppose, a lethal response at the very top. And the LD50, which is the lethal dose, which kills 50% of the test animals, is indicated there by the line. So this is that, the dose makes the poison. However, science is showing us that there's another way, that we need to really use the dose and response curve to rethink the way we regulate pesticides, and that's the non-monotonic dose response. And what this means is that there could be incidences with certain chemicals in certain populations, especially fetuses and young children, where the impact is experienced long before you even get to the assumed threshold, meaning small doses can have a very large effect. So, in other words, not all pesticides impacts are lethal. That's obviously, you see those. Not all are acute. That might be vomiting or fainting, things like that. And not all of them are immediately measurable. Some of them occur at very small levels and are not necessarily measurable till later in life. This is especially true of chemicals, including pesticides, that affect our endocrine system or our hormonal system. So when that occurs, the dose-response relationship of the chemicals is too low in the environment to actually measure. We don't always have the tools to measure it. And it can have additive effects, resulting in multiple symptoms. And combining pesticides at very low levels can dramatically enhance an unhealthy hormonal response. And just as a quick, how does that work? In our system, we have hormones coursing through our system. We have many organs that release hormones into our bodies, growth hormones, reproductive hormones, all sorts of hormones that regulate how we function in the world. And when those hormones are going through the system, they are going to attach to a receptor, and that receptor is going to help our cells have a response, hopefully the proper response. But when there's an endocrine disruptor, such as a pesticide like atrazine, it sort of shunts off the proper hormone and takes its place and causes an abnormal response in the cell. And that abnormal response could block certain necessary hormone messages or bind to receptors and cause exacerbated responses to the hormones. And again, the adverse effects can occur at very low doses. And of course, a big concern is exposure during pregnancy. I can't see the folks on this call, but I bet if I ask folks to raise their hand and if they were told by a doctor, their obstetrician when they were pregnant, that there was a thing called the placental barrier. I know I was told that when I was pregnant, that fetus was protected by something called the placental barrier. But now we know that is not the case, that what pregnant woman experiences can pass directly to the developing child. And we know this because there's been many studies done to measure pesticides, not only in the urine of pregnant women, but in the umbilical cord blood, in the baby's first bowel movement, and in breast milk. So we know that toxic chemicals can move pretty easily throughout the system. And this, of course, is a concern because the fetus is particularly vulnerable to impacts of pesticides. It's a very fragile window of development. They have immature detoxification systems, and their organs are developing at a very fast pace. So in the course of cell division, it could be that an adverse hormonal reaction could wreak havoc. Also, I want to point out that in the League's report, they rightly express the concern over mixtures of chemicals and the possible synergistic effects of chemicals. And that would be particularly true during pregnancy for the developing fetus. And in the environment, there are many ways to have these sort of low-level repeated exposures. It could be something as common as treatments for fleas and ticks on our pets. Those could be absorbed through dermal, you could be exposed through dermal absorption, or herbicides sprayed in parks and schools and public places where people expect to be safe and expect their children to be safe. And we roll in the grass and we have our picnics and we play soccer and football in those places. And those are places to take particular care to protect our children. And so scientists do know that exposures to chemicals such as pesticides in small amounts, especially at critical windows, can lead to learning disabilities, cognitive development problems later in life. Insecticides, which are neurotoxicants, can alter the development of the brain at lower doses than the EPA currently is able to assess through their registration programs as described by previous speakers. And sometimes we only learn of those things well after a pesticide has been registered, and then it's a really big lift to bring those pesticides back into the decision-making realm, whether it be at the state level or the federal level with the EPA, and have them banned. An example of this is chlorpyrifos. Beyond Toxics brought legislation to ban chlorpyrifos to the legislature in 2019 and 2020. And then following that, the Department of Agriculture put together a stakeholder group, and we worked together to phase out chlorpyrifos. And then just very recently, the EPA has banned the use of chlorpyrifos on food crops. So you can see that took many, many, many years to get that ban, and hard work for many groups, but it is a significant lift to do that. So my first policy objective goal would be to put children and pregnant women's health first. And the first step to that would be to update that school integrated pest management law that's on the books. It doesn't address endocrine disrupting chemicals. It's has outdated information on cancer-causing pesticides, and it would be wonderful to know that our schools are safe for children. Also, lots of speakers have already spoken about drinking water, and I didn't want to go into it too deeply. That's Kevin's expertise. But as he mentioned, very few pesticides are regulated under the Clean Water Act for drinking water standards, and the maximum contaminant levels often are, in my opinion, are too high to really protect human health. And as Kevin mentioned, a lot of those are being worked on right now by our federal agencies. But drinking water is a significant concern for many, many rural communities. About 70% of Oregon's communities get drinking water from rivers and streams that originate on forest land, and there's been quite a lot of public outcry about the use of herbicides on timber operations and what that could mean for their drinking water. And it's not a minor issue either. This is a photograph of a baby born with gastroschisis. This is linked directly with the presence of atrazine in drinking water. And as a result of impacts to newborn children from the mothers ingesting drinking water with atrazine, particularly in the Northwest where it's used on corn, there was a major lawsuit, and the result of that is that over 100 cities had to, the maker of atrazine had to reimburse over 100 cities for improving their water filtration systems so that people wouldn't be exposed to atrazine. So our second policy objective would be to increase the regulatory authority of our state agencies to keep pesticides out of our drinking water and our drinking water protection zones. As Kevin mentioned, currently much of the water quality work is voluntary, and that could be enhanced by better regulation. And coming to a close here, our third policy objective, keeping this at a high level, would be to standardize and require record keeping for all pesticide uses by people who are doing this either to grow crops or for commercial purposes. That is not always the case with all of our levels of pesticide licensing. That full, complete, standardized record keeping is required. I agree with previous speakers calling for the disclosure of inactive or inert ingredients. Again, as Kevin said, they're not always inactive, and sometimes those ingredients or adjuvants that are added to make a pesticide more potent in the environment can be as toxic or sometimes more toxic than the active ingredient. And lastly, we need to reinstate and fund Oregon's pesticide use reporting program. It was something that was in place, and then it was defunded, and then it was allowed to sunset. But without good data, we can't make good policy. And I would make a strong case to bring pesticide use reporting back. It shouldn't be political. It should be a case of science and disclosure and good record keeping. So in closing, again, I want to thank the League. We enjoy working with the League, speaking on behalf of Beyond Toxics, and throughout all the years, I've been part of policy decision-making, either at the local level or state level. The League has always been there making effective contributions to Oregon's policies. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa, for the presentation and for all your advocacy work. Our final speaker is Andrea Sonnen, who earned a double degree from Oregon State University in general agriculture and agricultural business management. Prior to working for the Oregon Department of Agricultural Pesticide Program, she worked in a seed testing lab and as a field representative for a vegetable seed multiplication company. She is now a pesticide enforcement case reviewer at the ODA and holds the position of interim pesticide lead investigator. Ms. Sonnen, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Share my screen here. Good evening, and thank you so much for including me in this exciting panel. I put together a quick overview of the ODA pesticides program for you that I hope will be somewhat supplemental to the study report that you've published, but I will admit there is some overlap in my comments. And I look forward to the questions and answers portion to come. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So the Oregon Department of Agriculture, through a cooperative agreement with the EPA, is the state lead agency for pesticide enforcement in the state of Oregon. Oregon has its own rules and regulations for pesticides. However, they largely mirror the federal rules and regulations. So Oregon is allowed to have different rules and regulations as long as they are stricter and not more lenient. A recent example of this is the rulemaking that ODA did to change the status of products containing chlorpyrifos. And EPA does provide some oversight of our program. We have to report to them how many different types of inspections that we do each year, and they do an annual review of our investigation reports to ensure that we are doing a complete and thorough investigation. In addition to our cooperation with EPA, we're also a member of PARC, which is the Pesticide Analytical and Response Center. Through PARC, we're able to work together with other state and federal agencies that may have an interest in a particular situation to ensure that all areas that may be affected are addressed. Other members that we work with through PARC include Oregon OSHA, Oregon DEQ, ODFW, Oregon Health Authority, and many more. PARC receives phone calls through 211, as well as reports of possible incidents from member agencies, which it can then refer to all of the appropriate members. For example, if a complaint comes in to ODA pesticides program, and the complainant states that they got sick from a neighboring application, which they also believe caused the deaths of several geese, ODA would start an investigation into the use of the pesticides while also forwarding the complaint to PARC, who would then forward it or refer it to OHA for follow-up on the health effects, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for follow-up on the geese. And then PARC can excuse me, sorry. PARC can then act as a facilitator between all of us and host and lead cooperative conversations. Okay. ODA Pesticides also works with other state lead agencies, especially the ones that are our neighbors, such as Washington State Department of Agriculture, the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, and Idaho Department of Agriculture. We routinely communicate with our state lead agency neighbors about issues that we may come across to see if we can share information between the two of us. And then we also work, well, we have many, we participate in a lot of national pesticide work groups. We've done a lot of presentations at the Association of American Pesticide Control Officials meetings, which is basically a conglomeration of all of the different states throughout America that regulate pesticides. And then our director at the Department of Agriculture is part of the National Association of Ag State Directors. And so with those, the participation with those groups, we are able to facilitate discussion and consensus about things that might be needed at a national level, need to be addressed at a national level. Okay. So Oregon requires that all pesticide products that you want to sell in the state of Oregon be registered with the Department of Agriculture. ODA currently has over 14,000 products listed for or registered for sale and distribution in Oregon. These include both general use products as well as restricted use products. They also include 24B products, which are pesticides that have an active ingredient that EPA has included on a list that they believe is low toxicity. There are federal label requirements that all of these types of products have to meet. The labeling requirements do differ between which type of product it is. And that is actually one thing that we are not allowed to deviate from with our rules from federal requirements. We cannot impose a labeling regulation other than what is in FIFRA. ODA also handles licensing of pesticide users and dealers. The licensing and registration program works to create and update tests, as well as new licenses and licensing requirements. The tests are administered at multiple community colleges and testing centers around the state. And then my primary work is within the enforcement side of the pesticides program. We conduct both for-cause and routine inspections, as well as observations of applications upon request. We just brought on 2 new investigators, 1 permanent and 1 temporary, which brings our numbers to 11 investigators located throughout the state, with the bulk of them being here in the Willamette Valley, in the I-5 corridor, and in the metro areas. In addition to the before mentioned work, both our investigators and our registration and licensing staff participate in trainings throughout the state every year. And we also have involvement in the Oregon Bee Project. So we have several different license types that we issue. We have an aerial applicator, commercial pesticide applicator, commercial pesticide operator, a consultant, a dealer, a private applicator, a public applicator, an immediately supervised trainee, and an apprentice applicator. All of the license types, as you can see, our commercial pesticide applicators and our private applicators are the majority of the types of licensing that we have. For many of the license types listed, there are categories that you can have. And I will note that each of the types of license that have an asterisk on this screen are licenses that require you to pass a test, at least one test, and in some instances more than one, to become licensed. For example, the commercial pesticide applicator's license, if you are contracted to make an herbicide application to a lawn at a apartment building, you would need to have taken and passed the license test for the commercial pesticide applicator, which is the laws and safety exam. And in addition, you would need to have passed the test that is specific for turf and ornamental herbicide applications. So following the initial passing of the license test, a license holder may renew their license by meeting the continuing education credit requirements that the department has set. These vary depending on the type of license held. For the license types that do not require a test, there are other requirements in place that they have to meet. So if you're a commercial pesticide operator, you have to maintain and provide proof of insurance to the department to maintain your license. If you're a pesticide dealer, you're required to keep detailed records of your restricted use product sales that must be available to ODA to review. And finally, if you are an immediately supervised trainee, you must have a licensed applicator supervising you at all times during any applications that you make. Now we'll take a look at a snapshot of some of the enforcement cases, in case numbers that we have had over the last 3 years. So I wanted to make sure to include fiscal year 2019 because it was the last normal type year we had with no contact restrictions. Prior to COVID, we set a new record each year for the number of total inspections conducted for at least 4 years. And that was starting in 2016. For both fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021, there were parts of the year in which travel and in-person routine inspections were cut down on to help prevent the spread of COVID. Our investigators did start doing some of the routine inspections that would normally do utilizing email, mail, and FaceTime. We don't have any restrictions. Oh, excuse me. We did not have any restrictions on follow-up investigations, with the exception that we had to wear a mask and do as much of it outside as possible and maintain distance. So looking at these numbers, both the ag use and non-ag use follow-up investigations are for-cause investigations, generally started by receiving a complaint. Non-agricultural use follow-up investigations include things like ants and other insect treatments to residential sites, herbicide applications to departments, and neighbor-to-neighbor disputes in residential areas. Neighbor-to-neighbor disputes have become much more common coming into our office. And then tracking cases are the calls or referrals that we get that do not have enough information for us to follow up on, and or people are just looking for information about a certain situation to make more informed choices. Both the applicator and the record inspections and the dealer record inspections are what I would call our more routine inspections. We review the records that applicators and dealers are required to keep for accuracy and completeness. For dealers, we also make sure that the product that they sold was sold to someone who had the correct licensing to use the product sold. So this is our 21 fiscal numbers. Here we have 20. And then 2019. And finally, the last thing that I wanted to talk about, which is really important to us, is that ODA strives to provide education and outreach to as many groups as we can. We would prefer to get compliance from the get-go compared to having to issue an enforcement action from something that was done wrong. And because of our approach, I believe that we have a good reputation for being an agency that isn't too bad to deal with. We provide a number of different pesticide presentations each year, generally during the latter fall and winter months. We have the ability to tailor presentations to the group that we are speaking to, and we have a variety of backgrounds throughout our investigator team to find the best fit for any given presentation. We've worked closely with two programs at Oregon State University, the School IPM program and the Pesticide Safety and Education program for the last several years to help inform them on what we are seeing in the field as areas needing more outreach on. And we have provided presentations during these trainings. Before COVID, we gave trainings at various locations throughout the state. But during this period, we have mostly been giving remote presentations, and our investigators have really done a good job of making that transition, even though I know they can't wait to be in person again. In addition to the PSEP and school IPM trainings, we have provided trainings for various industry groups, agricultural cooperatives, distributors, and any other entities that might request additional information. And with that, I will close my remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrea, for your presentation and for all your service at the ODA. During the question and answer session, Stephanie Page, who's director of the Natural Resources Program area of the ODA, will be joining Andrea to help answer questions from the audience. Now we'll ask the panel's questions from the audience. And I will start with a couple that I've been making notes on. The first is, and I don't know, any of you can tackle this, I guess. Washington State currently bans the use of atrazine in forestry. It sounds like that has not happened in Oregon. Does anyone know what the legislative status for regulation of atrazine is in Oregon? And you can all unmute.
I rely on our folks from our regulatory agencies to take that one. As far as I know, there is no current work on it.
Okay. All right.
I don't know, Stephanie or Andrea might be able to correct me, but I thought there there was a move afoot for the industry to voluntarily take atrazine off the list of herbicides they're going to use in Oregon. But maybe that was just, maybe it's in the works, but I've heard it from a couple of different people, but I haven't seen anything in writing yet. Have you?
For forestry or for?
For forestry.
Forestry. Okay.
Oh.
Okay.
You shared a link about the federal review of atrazine. Can you summarize what's happening at the federal level there?
Well, my understanding is that there are a number of different legal actions that are being taken by advocacy groups like Center for Biological Diversity about the federal registration for atrazine and trying to get that restricted. And essentially the upshot of that article is that the current EPA is looking at all those issues and trying to hopefully resolve them so they don't go all the way through the court process, but it's still unknown what the final outcome of that's going to be. So they're in the midst of a review is what I read from that article.
Okay, all right, thank you. Can someone give a quick overview of the current protections for farm workers? That was a question I've just got.
Quick might be hard here. There's a lot of different layers to that. The most important is the worker protection standard, which specifies what kind of, so for example, notice must be placed, what kind of sheltering is required, what kind of protective equipment is required. But that said, we've found in our interviews that many farm workers do not think that they're sufficiently protected by these rules. And even in some situations, do not think that the rules are being fully followed. And I think I saw Lisa about to comment on that. I know this is an area she has worked with a little bit more closely as far as the farm worker perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Amelia. Gosh, I think back in 2018, we started working with Oregon OSHA on the worker protection standard. And as a result of that, particularly regarding pesticides, Oregon adopted what's called the application exclusion zone. It's 100 feet. It's like OSHA likes to describe it as like a donut around the applicator, a zone that travels around with the tractor or the whatever application method is being used. And within 100 feet, for most pesticides, there shouldn't be anyone in that zone. And if it's a restricted use pesticide, it's extended to 150 feet. Stephanie, if I get any of this wrong, please correct me. However, we were very disappointed that the agency allowed folks to what's called shelter in place in their agricultural housing. And in your report, you have a photograph that I took actually in Jackson County of some typical farm worker housing. It's substandard housing and would not keep out drift. So we are quite concerned with this shelter in place aspect. But you're right, there are other, posting and notification and things like that did improve the requirements for PPE. And one last thing is, believe it or not, under the Trump administration, they were going to take away the requirement that someone had to be at least 18 years old to spray pesticides. And luckily, Oregon OSHA upheld, the minimum age of 18 for spraying pesticides commercially.
I just wanted to add a couple of things. This is Stephanie. I'm certainly not our subject matter expert on the worker protection standard, and we do collaborate very closely with the Oregon Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Oregon OSHA. We do have a worker protection standard educator position at the Department of Agriculture, and he has gone out and conducted trainings in Spanish as well as in English to workers. So, and that includes not only workers who are applying pesticides, but also workers who are working on a farm who need to be notified about the restricted entry interval when they shouldn't go back into a field, for example, after pesticides are sprayed. So there are pretty comprehensive requirements. There's a special section of pesticide labels that talk about the Federal Worker Protection Standard. So those are just a few more provisions, and just a note on ODA's role in terms of providing education. And it's an area where OSHA is the lead in Oregon.
All right, thank you. One question here is, what are the requirements for reporting data from the Department of Agriculture regarding numbers of complaints or toxicity that are received? Are these data published?
Oh, go ahead, Andrea.
That's a really good question. All of the information that I provided today, all of our case files, everything that we generate is available by public records request. It's not something at this time. Oh, yes, we are. We also produce a, sorry, I was going to say we didn't publish it, but then I remembered, yes, we do. We put out a quarterly bulletin that includes all of the final orders and enforcement actions that we have taken within that quarter. And it lists I think the name of the party plus the violative act that they did. So that is something that we do put out in that way.
And just one more note is that the Pesticide Analytical and Response Center also produces a biennial report of all of the complaints that have come into park, which park member agencies they were referred to, and then how they were responded to. So that is one more place that information is available.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And that is going to be, what labeling changes would you like to see that would improve user understanding, especially since pesticide sale at both online or in big box stores has not or limited staff trained about proper use at the point of sale? I don't know who wants to take that.
I guess I can start in talking about ODA's role on some of these issues. Generally, one of our roles is to educate people on some of the statements on existing labels and what they mean. For example, how to protect pollinators and what some of the label language related to pollinators means. We have collaborated with other states in several cases to comment when pesticide products are being reviewed at the federal level for re-registration. So just as an example, we had a persistent herbicide last summer that it's just one number in terms of our cases, but the amount of calls and concerns that we fielded was substantial. And it was a product that was found in compost that was applied to some gardens in the Portland area. We had some concerns regarding the label and collaborated with the Washington State Department of Agriculture to provide detailed comments to the US EPA on how the label could be improved and some considerations in the registration process. So often our comments are label specific. But I think in general, our other role is to help educate people on what language and the labels mean. But I think our role as an agency, we always try to communicate in very plain language and make things as readable and understandable to folks as possible. And so I think any labels that follow that same process and are as plain language as possible and easy for applicators to understand, that include pictures and pictograms are helpful.
Thank you. And I think our time is now up. Debbie, do you want to take over again?
Thank you all very much. This was fascinating. Your expertise, your background, and the level of caring that you bring to this topic are admirable and inspirational. Thank you so very much. We appreciate that critically important work that you do to improve the use of pesticides and biocides in Oregon. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization. We would be happy to welcome you to join with us. We'd also value your financial support in presenting these and other relevant programs. Please see our membership and donor information at lwvpdx.org. It's been a busy summer for the League, both locally and throughout the state. Our members in Portland have been attending the public meetings of the City of Portland Charter Review Commission since May. In June, we testified in favor of adding transparency as an element in the City Charter Review. The Oregon Legislature recently released its draft district maps. Many of us have been involved in work to assure fair district legislative and congressional district maps. And following our study on Portland Police Bureau accountability, our Portland League submitted a letter to the to District U.S. Judge Simon about the Police Bureau's recent efforts to comply with the terms. Busy time, indeed. This is Debbie Kay, President of the League of Women Voters of Portland. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. Please share it with your friends and family. We look forward to seeing you again at another civic education program. I can't wait till we can do it in person. Take good care, stay well. Thank you.